Hello, class, and welcome back as we transition into a part of the world that we have not explored very much thus far, and that is what will become the United Kingdom. Please title your notes for today The English Reformation and the Tudors. So, our lesson today is going to explore the infamous story of King Henry VIII and his six wives. You may have heard about this tale before. Just a forewarning, some of the content in this lesson can be complicated. On its core, it's a simple story. However, for most people, the names and events and family names and places can become very complicated when discussing European politics, especially an American audience. If you take more challenging courses in world history or European history in the future, you'll delve much more deeply into the content here. But for the purpose of our class, it's just going to be an overview. So, just to begin, the Tudor family is going to be our primary focus in today's class period, which begins with King Henry VII of England. King Henry VII comes to power following the infamous War of the Roses, a conflict fought between two warring families in England, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. So at the end, King Henry VII becomes king, and you'll see that the Tudors will reign between four different monarchs over the course of their reign, up until 1603. Just to show you on a map, this is where the United Kingdom will be. Obviously, the United Kingdom will eventually become England, Ireland, and Scotland. At this point, though, they're divided empires, and we'll be focusing on England. So, King Henry VIII becomes the King of England following the death of his brother, who was supposed to be the heir to the throne. His brother's name was Arthur. So, Henry VIII is a devout Catholic. He attacks Martin Luther during the Reformation after he posts his 95 Theses. He says it's ridiculous and that, he's totally loyal to the church. However, something personal happens. He desperately wants a son, a male heir to the throne, and at the time he's married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. This is where things get really complicated, just thinking of like the family lineage and all the different family names and backgrounds of the different people in the story. But just stay with me. Catherine of Aragon is a princess from Spain. She is the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, dual monarchs in Spain at the time, most notable for funding the voyage of Christopher Columbus. So just keep that in the back of your mind. At this time, most marriages were made for political reasons. So Catherine of Aragon was supposed to marry Arthur. Arthur dies, and then Catherine ends up being wed to his brother only a few months later, King Henry VIII. They're married for 24 years, and they have a daughter together. Her name is Mary. But at this point, no woman had ever been the ruler of England. So by this point, Catherine is 42 years old. Henry realizes that she's not going to be able to have any more children. So he begins looking elsewhere for someone to produce a male heir. This creates quite the scandal in England. Henry VIII essentially begins having an affair with another woman in the royal court who demands that he get a divorce from his wife before actually having a child together. It's a much younger queen. She's in her 20s. Her name is Anne Boleyn. I'll introduce her in just a second. But the problem is the church, the Catholic Church, would not permit the king to get a divorce. That's just not how canon law would have worked at the time. So the Pope technically had the power to annul or cancel the marriage between the king and the queen, but political reasons made it a bit complicated. So again, Catherine of Aragon is a princess from Spain, and she's also the nephew of King Charles V. So Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were Charles V's grandparents. So it's complicated, but Catherine essentially is his aunt. So the Pope obviously needs to work closely with the Holy Roman Emperor and now the King of Spain too. So following through on this could completely destabilize the Pope's power. So Henry, following the advice of one of his core advisors, calls for Parliament to come into session. It's called the Reformation Parliament, and he basically demands that the Pope's power in England come to an end, and instead power transition into the hands of the king, aka him. So this becomes known as the Act of Supremacy. So this is the transfer of power from the Pope to being centralized in the English government. So the king now is not only the King of England, but also the head of the Church of England, the C of E. So Henry secretly marries Anne Boleyn in a small ceremony, and Parliament legitimizes his divorce to Catherine. So, big thing to just note is that the active supremacy is now transferring the power from the Pope to the king. Just to show you, this is the trial of Catherine. You can see her begging in front of her husband not to go through with this. Catherine did not want a divorce, and she gave like a long plea, begging him not to ultimately annul the marriage and divorce her, but he goes through with it anyway. She's exiled from the kingdom, and she basically raises Mary the First on her own on the outskirts of England. So Anne Boleyn is his second wife. They have a daughter together. Her name is Elizabeth I. Ultimately, though, Anne Boleyn has a series of miscarriages after Elizabeth I and is unable to produce a male heir again. So a constant source of conflict emerges between the two of them, and King Henry VIII ultimately charges Anne Boleyn with treason. The charges are completely unfounded. They're not true. He says that she's conspiring with his political enemies, and she ends up being decapitated, beheaded, after first serving a prison sentence in the Tower of London. So Henry's third wife is Jane Seymour, the one that he infamously actually loved the most, and together they do actually conceive a son, Edward VI. Edward VI is born very sickly and ultimately does not live for very long, and this creates quite a power dynamic or a shifting power dynamic in England. So you have Anne Boleyn is a Protestant, so Edward VI is a Protestant ruler like his father, but then because Edward VI dies, it creates a power vacuum in England, and the question becomes who will then sit on the throne after King Henry VIII. So, in terms of his other wives, Henry VIII marries Anne of Cleves, who he ultimately divorces. Then Catherine Howard, who has affairs with other men, while Henry is having affairs with other women. Ultimately, she is decapitated, and her lovers' heads are put on London Bridge as a show of anger and intimidation. And then finally, he marries Catherine Parr. So his final wife, Catherine Parr, is the only one to survive past King Henry VIII. And one of the things that she does is she implores the king to pass a piece of legislation that makes his daughters successors to the throne in the event that something happens to Edward, which it does. So once Edward VI dies, it goes to his next eldest living child, who is Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. So Edward dies at 9 years old. Mary I takes the throne. The only issue is Catherine of Aragon was a devout Catholic, and she raised Mary I to be a Catholic as well. So it creates a horrifying religious power struggle in England where people have converted to Protestantism, and now you have someone coming to power who wants a more traditional Catholic approach, and it becomes an all-out bloodbath where Protestants are being murdered for their religion, and Mary earns the nickname Bloody Mary. So, Mary also does not live very long, and her sister, who is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, ends up taking power. Anne Boleyn was a Protestant, so is Queen Elizabeth. So she restores Protestantism and develops what's called the Anglican Church to restore some of the peace among the people living in England. So Elizabeth is essentially the head of the church, just like the active supremacy made King Henry VIII the head of the church. And it's a state church, so it's open to everyone. So, in terms of some essential features of the Anglican Church, Protestants and Catholics are both appeased in its development. For Protestants, sermons are in English so that people can understand them, whereas Catholics had them in Latin at the time, a language that people did not understand. Protestants, the priests were allowed to marry, and then for Catholics, some of the rituals were maintained. You'll see in a lot of the Protestant religions, a lot of it is the scaling back of Catholic rituals and making things a little bit more progressive, and that oftentimes becomes the source of contention. Just as a quick note, just to make this a little bit more complicated and give you one extra name to remember, Mary I marries King Philip II of Spain. King Philip II of Spain is the son of Emperor Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. After Charles V retires, he makes his son Philip the King of Spain and his brother Ferdinand the Holy Roman Emperor. So Philip marries Mary. They're both Catholic to facilitate another union between the two different nations. They're both becoming very powerful at the time due to their exploration and their colonization in the New World. But then after Mary dies, Philip still wants to maintain this alliance with England. He proposes to Queen Elizabeth. She never responds to his proposal. And the church does not legitimize the proposal anyway, because they say that Elizabeth is a Protestant and King Philip has to marry a Catholic. And the church also never saw the Reformation Parliament as legitimate, and they still consider England to be Catholic. So they argue that Queen Elizabeth is not actually the Queen of England because that marriage was never like a legitimate marriage. And they argue that Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, is the actual heir to the English throne. So it just makes everything incredibly complicated in England. In terms of Queen Elizabeth I, she is nicknamed the Virgin Queen because she never has like a long-term husband or male suitor, and she also has no male heirs. She is the one who's responsible for overseeing some of the early colonization in the New World. She turns to these colonies to finance a lot of the financial issues in England and major wars that she has to deal with during her time in power. She ultimately has to square up against Philip II, who tries to invade England using the infamous Spanish Armada. Due to just a random string of luck, a major storm hits the Armada, and the English are successful in defending themselves and really solidifying their power and their legacy as one of the major empires in Europe. So, I know this was a very complicated lesson with a lot of different names. So, if you have questions for me, make sure to ask in class. But just as a little bit of recap, in terms of the Tudor rulers, we have King Henry VII, followed up by King Henry VIII, obviously, and then he has three children. So we have Edward VI, right, his third child, who he has with Jane Seymour. He dies, and then it goes back in order to his original wife, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary I, who's a Catholic. And then after Mary passes away, it goes to Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, who's a Protestant. She has no male heirs, and that marks the end of the Tudor line. Okay? So that will wrap us up for today's lesson. Our final stop in our chapter on the Reformation will be the Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Church attempt to reform itself and prevent their followers from effectively splintering off and becoming more Protestant denominations.